This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. So this is going to be the first in a 7-week series that's only going to actually drop every other week. So I guess it's technically a 14-week series with 7 parts. I don't really know how to describe what is about to happen here. But what took place in my personal life that prompted this series? In 2020, in January of 2020, so obviously right before the pandemic, I was asked by the pastor of my church to fill in and be the interim student ministries director for our church because our student ministries director left. And obviously, I was going to begin in March of 2020. And we all know what happened in March of 2020. The entire world shut down and everyone was forced into their homes. So there was a 7-week period where we had to do youth group all online because of the lockdown protocols. We were not able to meet in person. And so I recorded a couple of videos during that time where I explained some of the basic concepts that I thought were essential for every Christian to know. And so the way that I worked the program during that period of time was that I would record these videos of me explaining some very important concept from the Bible. And then I would release them on YouTube and send the link out to all my students. And then when we met on our Zoom calls on Sunday nights, we would talk about whatever it was that I discussed during the video. So they would come into that video already having known what we had talked about, and that wound up working out pretty well. So I did a 7-part series called What We Believe, which was all about some of like the basic concepts that are essential for every Christian. And we had some really great conversations based around that. And all of those were on my own personal YouTube channel. And I realized a couple of weeks ago that some of this stuff was actually pretty good. And it would be a really fun thing to release them as a short form podcast. So what I am going to be doing on Thursdays, beginning with this week's episode, is every other Thursday between now and the end of April, I'm going to release one of these old videos from 2020 where I talk about the basics of our faith. And this one, of course, I think is the most fundamental and essential. This is a video about the gospel. Now, one of the really there are a couple interesting things, not just one, but several interesting things about these videos that I think that you should be aware of before we play it today. The first is that I had this really crazy event happen to me at the exact same time, whereas at the very end of January, around the same time that I was offered the interim position of youth director at our church, where I went and got a haircut and got my haircut nice and short and looked real good. So all throughout the month of February, I usually at that point in my life, I was only having to get my hair cut once every 4 or 5 weeks. So we get into early March, and on Friday, March 13th, they announced that they were going to be shutting down the schools and basically the rest of the world. And I went to work that day and I was giving a high five to all my kids and everything was great. I was like, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. They said 2 weeks stop spread. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks, which of course obviously didn't happen. And then after I left work that Friday, I went up to the grocery store and bought, some food and everything because people were panic buying. And so I needed to go up and buy like 2 weeks worth of groceries because I was worried that people were just going to buy all the stuff that we needed. And so I went up and did that. And the place that I went and got my haircut at the time was right next door to the grocery store. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I should go and get a haircut because it's been a little while. But then I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go and get a haircut tomorrow because it'll be Saturday and I'll have the time to do it. And our governor, Andy Beshear, who is one of the most authoritarian governor lockdown people in the entire country, decided that night that haircut places were no longer allowed to be open. And so I did not get my haircut that day. So I was about a month in a week or two out from getting a haircut. And in these videos, you will see that my hair is extremely long. And for really the duration of all the videos that you're going to watch over the next several weeks, you will see my hair just getting longer and longer. And there was a very weird period during the first couple of weeks where I let my beard grow out too. I'm not proud of that, but you'll be able to see my ridiculous haircut and my ridiculous beard in that video. So I wanted you guys to see all of this in its glory. So that's the first dynamic there. The second dynamic is it's really interesting going back and watching these videos that I recorded for youth group a while back, because while I still believe that every single video that I'm going to release is absolutely essential to our faith, in a lot of ways, my thinking on every single issue that I'm going to address over this like kind of 7 episode series that I'm doing here, my thinking on all of these issues has changed and developed over this time. So you're going to listen to me interviewing all of these biblical scholars and then listen to what I had to say 5 years ago when we were going through the middle of this pandemic. And you'll see that while I agree with a lot of what I said, there are some areas in which I've changed my position, or I've nuanced or developed my position on a lot of these views. And this week, where I talk about the overview of the gospel, is one of those where I agree with much of what I said back during that time in my life, but there are definitely, based on more research and reading, areas and aspects of this particular issue that I've changed my opinion. I think that's really helpful and that's really good. So I'm very excited for this 7-week journey that we're going to be going on together. All of these are going to be very short episodes. We're talking about 15 to 20 minutes, and my introductions are probably going to be a lot shorter in the future, so maybe even shorter than 15 minutes. But I think this is just a great opportunity for my listeners who might be new to Christianity or might have never thought about like the really big or really essential or really important ideas that are at the heart of what it is that we believe as Christians. It's a great opportunity to kind of explore those ideas. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next several weeks, actually really over the next several months, because like I said, I'm only going to release one of these every other week. So we'll have plenty of time for this. And this is going to be the first one on the gospel. So guys, again, I'm really thankful that you're here for this. I'm really thankful that you love and support everything that I do. You guys are incredible listening to me talk about the things that I'm passionate about every single week. And I hope that this is beneficial for everyone that's listening. So thank you guys so much for what you do. And let's get into the very first re-released, lesson that I taught my students when I was the interim youth director at my church in 2020. Here we go. Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing well in quarantine. I know that the first couple of days of NTI have probably been very exciting for you, and I know that there are a lot of changes right now. So I am, as you guys have heard, my name is Alex Bernardo. You guys know me because I filled in for Pastor Sarah when she was on maternity leave to do the lessons, and I'm going to be kind of stepping in over the next 3 months as they look to find someone to hire to be the new student ministries director. So I met with the volunteers the other night, and we decided that even though we're in quarantine, we're going to try to find ways to keep on connecting with you guys. One of the easiest ways that we're going to do that is we'll still have a devotional every week. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to film a short devotional. I'm going to put it on YouTube, and then I'm going to put the links on our Facebook page, our Twitter page. I'll send them out in an email. So I'll make sure you guys get the devotionals. I'm still going to be sending the discussion questions to the volunteers. So if you want to talk to me or someone else about the devotional, we can do that. And I'll give you some more information about all of those things when we are done. Beginning today, we're going to be talking about what we believe as Christians. So we're starting a whole new video series on what exactly it is that we as Christians believe about God and about the Bible and about all of those things. So we're going to spend a couple of weeks taking a look at what exactly it means to be a Christian. So there is one place in the Bible where I think all of our basic beliefs are summed up, and that is in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And when I was taking over for Sarah a couple months ago, we took a look at Ephesians, and we learned that Ephesians was written by a man named Paul. And Paul is a Jew, and in Acts chapter 9, Paul is called by God in order to share the message of Jesus with people that are not Jewish. Those are people that they call the nations or the Gentiles in the Bible. So what Paul is doing in Romans 1 through 5 is he is making contact with the church in Rome, which is the capital of the Roman Empire, and he's never been to that church. He's never met the people that are a part of the church, so he's making contact with them for the very first time. And so Paul has to prove that he's legitimate. Like, Paul has to prove that he knows what he's talking about, that he's a serious leader. And so what he wants to do at the very beginning of the letter to the Romans is outline what he believes about Jesus. And he expects that the Romans are going to believe these same things as well. And so in Romans 1 through 5, Paul outlines all of the things that he thinks are important for Christians to believe, and he assumes that the people in Rome, by seeing that, will know that Paul is for real, that Paul's not teaching things that are crazy or that are outside of the norm. So I'm going to read Romans 1:1-5 real quick, and we're going to spend the next couple of weeks going over some of the things that Paul says about what it is that we're supposed to believe as Jesus followers. And here's what Paul says in Romans 1:1-5. He says, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets and the holy scriptures concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who is declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake. Okay, so Paul says a lot of things there, and some of those words might sound familiar, some of those words might not be very familiar. That's why we're going to spend a couple of weeks breaking down what exactly it is that Paul means. But I want to step back real quick. Paul calls this message, all of these teachings about Jesus, all of these beliefs of the church, Paul calls this message the gospel, okay? And he says that in verse 1, that he was set apart for the gospel of God. So this whole message about Jesus is summed up by one word, gospel. The thing about this term is that it's a term that no one else had ever used before to describe the message about Jesus. So Paul, in other words, kind of takes this term, and it's a term that's based on a Greek word that means good news. We're going to talk about that here in just a second, but he applies that term to the message of Jesus and to the core beliefs that have to do with Jesus. So he's the first one to use this term to describe teachings or beliefs about Jesus. But what exactly does that term gospel mean? And this is what we're going to take a second to look at here. So the term gospel, it comes from a Greek word that basically means good news. The word in Greek is euangelion. And Paul uses this term to describe his message about Jesus. And I think that he chooses this term for a couple of reasons. Now, the very first reason is argued by a New Testament scholar named James Dunn. And he's a Scottish scholar. I love James Dunn. He's one of my favorite scholars in the whole world. He's got the cool Scottish accent and everything like that. And what James Dunn does is he realizes that Paul uses this Greek word, euangelion, good news. And that this Greek word, again, is found in the Greek translation of a book in the Old Testament called Isaiah, especially in Isaiah chapter 61. And James Dunn notices that this word gospel is used whenever the prophet Isaiah talks about God rescuing his people. So one of the reasons why Dunn argues that Paul uses the term gospel to describe the message about Jesus is it has to do with that idea that through Jesus, God is rescuing or saving or restoring his people. So Dunn argues that Paul deliberately takes that phrase, which is in Isaiah, and applies it to the message about Jesus because it has to do with God rescuing his people. The second reason why that term is used is because it was a popular term in the Roman Empire. So the letter to the Romans that Paul writes is written sometime in the late 50s. And I'm not talking about the 1950s. I'm talking about like the 50s, like year 50, okay? And at that point, Rome was under control of an emperor named Nero. And as Nero gets older and older, he's not so much in the late 50s, but as he gets older and older and closer to his death in the late 60s, he becomes more crazy. And those of you guys that have taken high school history class might know that Nero blamed Christians when he accidentally burned down part of Rome. So Nero's a crazy guy, and I'm hoping that I can show you a picture of him if the editing software works. So I'm going to stop right here. Here's a picture of Nero. He should be the one that's circled in red. That's the goal, okay? So Rome has been an empire for about 80 years. And when Paul writes, that same Greek term, euangelion, which means good news, was used to describe the rule of the emperor. So the emperor was good news. The Roman Empire was seen as good news for people living within it. And so there's another scholar named N.T. Wright. You might be familiar with him because he's probably the most famous interpreter of the New Testament in the entire world. He's British, so he sounds smart, which means that Americans like to hear what he has to say. N.T. Wright argues that Paul also uses this term to challenge the power of the Roman Empire. Empire. So in other words, Paul is saying if that term good news is used to refer to Emperor Nero as being the emperor of Rome, Paul is also using that term good news to say basically that Jesus is the real king. So in conclusion, what does Paul mean when he uses the term gospel? Number one, Paul comes up with this term, okay? He's the first person to take that Greek word euangelion and use it to describe his message and the basic beliefs of the church. So over the next couple of weeks, as we look at the beliefs in more detail, all of these are a part of what Paul calls his gospel. The second thing is that it comes from the Greek Old Testament, especially Isaiah, and it describes how God rescues his people. Okay, so it describes specifically how God rescues or saves his people. And then the third point here is that it deliberately challenges the power of the Roman Empire, that in some way Paul uses the term to imply or to say that Jesus is king, or that the message of Jesus is more important than any of the messages of the Roman Empire, and even more important than the Roman emperor himself. Okay, so there are three questions that I want you to think about this week, and you guys can leave your questions or comments in the section below this this video, or email me or other volunteers if you want to talk about it more. My first question is, how is the message about Jesus good news to you in particular? How is this message good news to you? Number two, you might have heard we're in the middle of a quarantine, so we're not allowed to see each other in public, but we're called as Christians to bring good news to other people. So how can we, during this time, bring good news to other people, even though most of us are more or less stuck inside our house and going crazy? Number three, why is it important to know what we believe about Jesus? So as Christians, we know that God loves us and all that stuff is great, but why is it important to know exactly what it is as Christians we believe about Jesus? Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.